Just off the city centre, shaped by nature, landscaped by men. This is Bukit Brown Cemetery. At rest are the country's forefathers, whose collective timelines span 150 years of our development into modern Singapore. Their tombstones are touchstones in living memory for a new generation of descendants. This is our history from the hills. The Civilian War Memorial, situated in the city centre, is dedicated to the civilians who perished during the Japanese occupation here in Singapore. The end of the war in September 1945 was the beginning of closure for families who lost loved ones. Peter Park, the writer of a heritage blog, Rojak Librarian, is on the trail of a war hero whose roots can be traced to Bukit Brown, but whose final resting place is across from the cemetery at MacRitchie Reservoir.
So when I was researching on Lim Law, I said, his son is Mr. Lim Bo Seng. So I thought of making a trip down to MacRitchie Reservoir to also pay respects to Lim Bo Seng's tomb.
Lim Bo Seng was the first son of Lim Low, a building contractor in late 19th century Singapore, who was buried in Bukit Brown. His gravestone still marks the spot, although his remains were exhumed many years ago. Lim Bo Seng himself remains one of Singapore's more famous war heroes. He was one of the leading members of Force 136, a special underground force formed by the British to support resistance groups behind enemy lines. His unit operated in Malaya.
Lim Bo Seng was arrested by the Japanese in March 1944, and he was tortured, and they tried to make him tell where were the rest of the Force 136 members were, and he never said a word. He was tortured, put into a prison which were in terrible conditions, and he died as a result of probably dysentery in prison. So, and he was buried in this prison in Batu Gajah, Perak, and probably in a marked grave just beside the prison, I suppose. His remains were brought back to Singapore and given a hero's funeral. There are pictures of his funeral in City Hall near the Padang, and finally interred right behind me, where you see in MacRitchie Reservoir. It wasn't as grand as what you see right now. It was just a simple marker, and later on the Lim Bo Seng Memorial Fund erected a much more better tomb befitting of his contributions and efforts.
While Lim Bo Seng's contribution to the nation was in the theatre of war, Lim Low's contribution was in the commercial landscape of Singapore.
Lim Low is a tauke and an industrialist. He was a building contractor, and he was responsible for a number of iconic buildings in Singapore that still exist today. For example, the Goodwood Park Hotel. He built the Parliament House and also the Victoria Theatre, I believe. What interests me is the interconnectivity between one person and another through time. And I guess by sharing that, also let people aware, without Mr. Lim Law, there won't be Mr. Lim Bo Seng. So it's just that kind of, I guess, connection that I'm trying to make and share with people who are reading the article.
Notably, Lim Low left his mark in the Hong Sang Si Temple, started by Laman migrants in 1827. Born in Laman County, Fujian Province, he never forgot his birthplace. He designed and led the rebuilding of the temple in 1908, when it was relocated to Muhammad Sultan Road. The temple, which was built in the traditional Southern Chinese style, once housed one of Singapore's earliest free schools.
在1914年，因为我们的南安先贤看到河水山这一带的很多小孩子没有上学，所以就提议在凤山市左右的空地设立南明学校。
Among the founding members of Nanming School was Lim Ki Tong. Alex Lim, his great-great-grandson, shares early memories of visiting the tomb as a child.
We just pay respect, and as kids, you know, it's fun to play around in the rural, but we didn't really know what actually he did. They only said that, that's your zhou zhou, all right? So it's only later on, then we start to get to understand further what actually he did. He actually contributed much further to not just to Hongshanxi, but also in setting up of a primary school for the poor living in River Valley area at that time. It's a different kind of primary school that we know of now, all right? They are basically taught in Hokkien. After they graduate from primary schools, then they say, what's next for them? Because again, these kids start to roam again on the street. So initiated by Mr. Tan Ka-ki, all right? So they get a few schools directors, primary school directors, to set up a Chinese secondary school, which is what we have, the present Chinese high school, all right? And the first committee was actually set up by, I think, 26 such primary schools from various parts of Singapore. And Lim Ki Tong is one of the first committee then.
So you can see in the olden days, the primary school in Singapore are differentiated by 5 different dialects. You got Hokkien primary school, Cantonese primary school, they speak Cantonese in the school. Then after that, Tan Ka-ki in 1919, start a high school. It's called the Chinese High.
The Chinese high school served as a headquarters for the Japanese during the war. After the war, the school resumed providing secondary education in Chinese. By the 1950s, competing education approaches from different groups arose.
Have here in the 1950s this increasingly acrimonious debate about Singapore's political identity. So should the education system be increasingly Western or Chinese orientated? So you do have those who look to China, like Tan Lak Sai, who were prepared to put down money for Nanyang University as the first and only Chinese language university. Others were prepared to support Chinese schools in Singapore.
The promotion of Chinese education had a strong advocate in Tan Lak Sai. Tan Lak Sai, a rubber magnate, was a protege of Chinese high school founder Tan Ka-ki. Tan Lak Sai was first buried in Koh Phi Swa in the Greater Bukit Brown complex of cemeteries. But some years ago, his grave was cleared to make way for a highway.
What we know today as Peranakan tiles were actually Art Nouveau Majolica tiles, imported by the British and made popular with the privileged class almost 100 years ago. The Peranakans loved them very much in their homes, as they did to their graves too.
Prominent education pioneer Tan Lak Sai's tomb no longer exists at Koh Phi Swa. But Raymond Goh, a volunteer guide and tomb enthusiast, has discovered where it once stood.
We are now actually on Koh Phi Swa, but Koh Phi Swa is actually split into 2 parts by the PIE running across it. At that time, it belonged to the Hokkien Hui Kwan. Tan Lak Sai, in fact, was in 1949, and he was actually the president of the Hokkien Hui Kwan. So when he died in 1972, he was buried here in this area. But what happened is a few years later, there was a road widening project for this Whitley Road, and he and his elder brother was one of the tombs affected by the road widening project, and so they have to exhume him and reinter him in another place.
Raymond's research on Tan Lak Sai provides him information beyond the tomb.
I know that he was born in 1897, and then he came to Singapore to work in 1914. At that time, he worked under Tan Ka-ki, who was one of the rubber pioneers in Singapore. He himself later went on to set up an Echo company, which became one of the largest rubber export company in that area at that time. And so, when he became rich, Tan Lai Sai he's also become a philanthropist. No? He donated a lot of money to build school. Of course, he's most remembered for setting up this Nanyang University.
Tan Lak Sai mooted the idea of Nanyang University in 1953 and went on to contribute $5 million to its initial building fund. He also rounded up his brethren from the Hokkien Hui Kwan to donate 523 acres of land towards the building. Fundraising efforts ran the gamut of the populace, from tycoons to blue-collared workers.
One interesting thing I heard is actually from one friend whose father was a rickshaw rider. She said that in the past, his father knew the reason why his father remembered Tan Lak Sai so much was because Tan Lak Sai donated a lot to the charity, and at that time he promised people that for every dollar that you donate, I will match the dollar. You know, he's a businessman, but the way that he's willing to match the donation shows the greatness of this man.
The Hokkien Hui Kwan's contributions to the early education system in Singapore were also mirrored by the Nanyang Gongsi, which till this day has affiliations with several schools bearing the Nanyang name. In 1830, prominent Teochew leader Seah Yu Chin set up the Nanyang Gongsi to take care of the welfare of Teochew migrants. Expanding into education, Nanyang Girls' School was founded in 1940. Among the Nanyang Gongsi board members who played a major part in the school was Lim Kim Seng, a successful Teochew merchant in 1930s Singapore.
I am Mr. Lim Kim Seng's grandson, and probably the last grandson that he saw before he passed away, because I was only about 2 months when he passed away. He had 2 wives, and my mother was the first daughter of his second wife. Granddad was actually very actively involved with social activities amongst the local Teochew population. He was actually one of the founding fathers of the Nanyang Girls' School. At that time, it was called the Nanyang Girls' School. Later, the name changed to Nanyang Primary School. At that time, he was helping the colonial government look after the interests of women as well as children. And one of the tenets of the Nanyang Gongsi was to actually help in terms of education.
Among numerous accomplishments, Lim Kim Seng is perhaps best remembered for his contribution to education. But grandson James Yip holds other impressions of the man.
He spent a lot of his time actually visiting the homes of underprivileged Chinese Teochew populations in Singapore. He visited the prisons in Singapore as well to make sure that Chinese inmates were well taken care of and that they were not abused. He was also appointed as a justice of a peace, and that also allowed him to actually sign people's marriages and at the same time keep track of the local populace.
Lim Kim Seng's dedication to education and social causes caught the attention of the British authorities. In 1954, he was one of the few locals to be conferred the Member of the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire. Member of the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire is a highly desirable award that entitles its members to the usage of Sir or Dame before their names. Over at another hill lies another pioneer who was similarly conferred the Order of the British Empire and known for his fiery temper.
In the traditional Omega layout, however, there are those that detract from the norm, such as the tomb of Lee Kim Soo, the maker of LKS matchsticks, also known as the Matchstick King. One of few adventurously built in Art Deco splendor.
When the British returned to power after the war, Singapore was besieged by a period of social unrest. Peter Park tells us about one pioneer who faced up to rioters.
So in the 50s, it was very turbulent years for Singapore. So there were labor union riots. There was also communist unrest in Singapore. So some of these communists, what they did was they burned buses or transportations in Singapore to create an atmosphere of fear, I suppose. So one of the main targets of buses being burned was Tay Koh Yat's buses.
Tay Koh Yat came to Singapore a poor migrant from Kingman at the age of 22. He was best known for being a pioneer in public transport. he set up the Tay Koh Yat Bus Company in 1938.
He noticed that the transportation system in Singapore was very poor, and he decided to do something about it to help improve the transportation system in Singapore. So in 1921, with only 2 buses, he ended up being one of the largest bus companies in Singapore.
The bus riots of 1955 arose from industrial disputes and social strife. Although most of the buses targeted were those from the Hock Lee Bus Company, Tay Koh Yat's buses were not spared.
In the papers, an account of Mr. Tay Koh Yat with his driver tailing one of his buses, witnessing 4 arsonists trying to burn his bus. In the 50s, Mr. Tay Koh Yat himself was in his 70s already. Just imagine a 70-year-old man coming out from his car and said, "Tangkap! Tangkap!" which means in Malay, catch this arsonist. And that helped prevented, I suppose, the bus from being burned.
Even though unrest was rife at that time, life went on, and people made time for entertainment.
In that sense, you have a very cosmopolitan culture, popular culture evolving in the 1950s, with at its roots going back to the 1930s with the introduction of the radio and the gramophone newspapers. So you already have the basis pre-World War II of this diversity of popular cultures from China, from the US increasingly, from Europe. And this is now then played out in the 1950s.
Amusement parks such as Great World, New World and Beauty World rose in popularity and offered venues for various types of performers.
Performances were a very important part of the entertainments at the Worlds. You had Chinese song and dance troops, the Ge Wu Tuan. You had Bangsawan troops from Indonesia. You had bands, dance hall bands from the Philippines. And you can see all these troops traveled around the region performing at different venues. So traveling performing troops was a very important part of the regional entertainment scene. And outside the Worlds, these included the circuses as well.
One such popular circus troupe was the Tai Tien Q Circus. In the mid-1950s, their death-defying acts and exotic animals captured the imagination of the young and old. Lisa Leong is a descendant of Sun Si Ting, the founder of Tai Tien Q Circus. At Bukit Brown, she pays her respects to her great-grandfather.
My grandfather was actually one of Sun's son-in-law. His name is Si Bing Sen. His name is also engraved on the tomb. I was actually quite intrigued because I don't know of anybody who tells me that his or her grandfather is, let's say, a circus proprietor or someone involved in any circus business.
The Tai Tien Q Circus disbanded at the outbreak of World War II, but reunited after normalcy returned.
Actually, Sun Si Ting died before the Japanese surrender. His 2 sons and 2 son-in-law took over the reins of the circus. But after the Japanese surrender, the circus was physically no longer existing. I mean, the facilities were gone, the animals were dead. So they actually have to rebuild from the start. So what they did was they actually have to buy those army tents from Sungai Road and sew them up again. That was how they make their first tent.
The Sun family turned adversity into opportunity, and at its peak, the Tai Tien Q Circus toured Malaya and the region even as far as the Philippines. On a recent visit to a flea market, Lisa chanced upon an unexpected find. Rare photos capturing unforgettable moments of the Tai Tien Q Circus. They held precious memories of various acts and, more importantly, those of her aunt, a performer in the troupe.
I didn't expect to find anything of that sort. And of course, as anyone would expect, I bought them all.
Whilst Lisa is momentarily reunited with her family's past glory, Anne Lim, a cousin to James Yip, reconciles with memories of her grandfather, Lim Kim Seng.
He died in on the 20th of August 1967. I was doing my O-levels at that time. I have very fond memories of him. I think he loved me a lot because I'm one of the grandkids that stayed with him all these years. I think he was a very kind-hearted man because I remembered at one incident there was a lady from Swatao, China who came out to Singapore, and he was with the Ngiang Kongsi, and he recommended this lady to the Ngiang Primary School to sell sweets and chocolates. And, you know, he always cares about those not so fortunate people.
Lim Kim Seng passed away in 1967, and his funeral stood as a testament of the high regard people held for him.
When he died, we had a very big thing regarding his funeral. There are lots of people from the Teochew clan, you know, and quite a lot of people came, all relatives and friends and business associates.
While Anne holds precious her first-hand recollection of her grandfather, James Yip, who was only 2 months old when Lim Kim Seng died, can only content with accounts he gathered from his mother.
I've always known from my mum that he was an early Teochew leader, a great man in his time. But it's only in the last few years, with a bit of soul-searching, and also with the pending demise of part of Bukit Brown Cemetery, that, you know, I began to search my roots and began to wonder who my grandparents actually were. And I think this in part is every Singaporean's hope to want to know, you know, what happened in those days. And I think Bukit Brown is an important and integral part of our nation's history, because without Bukit Brown and without looking at all the individual people who have played a role in Bukit Brown, we would not really be the Singapore that we are today.
The foundation of Singapore rests firmly on the tombs of our forefathers, from the humble working classes to the wealthy Tauke's who answered the needs of the community. All are honoured here for the part they played in our history.